in this book, which led to a huge number of BBC interviews in which the central question was, well, is Tony Blair a neocon, and do you consider him a neocon? And I was being very polite and saying it's not my place to say, really, to characterize the Prime Minister's political views. I respect, I like the speech, but I certainly would let him characterize himself. And finally, I couldn't resist after, of course, a lot of badgering, and broke down and said, well, I guess I sort of do consider Tony Blair at least a neocon sympathizer. And he spent the next 24 hours getting beat up in the press for this and had to finally say that he considers himself a progressive. And if neocons chose to be like progressives, that was fine with him. But he did a little prudent distancing himself, I would say, from the neocon label. In any case, President Bush gets inaugurated in 2 days, and he's not in the book, actually. Condi Rice is in the book. Tony Blair's in the book. John Bolton's in the book. I take this as Irwin's subtle way of suggesting, in the spirit of Leo Strauss, whom Ken mentioned, that since Bush is not actually an author in the book, he's the most important neocon. Since one of Strauss's principles of reading important books was that sometimes that which is not mentioned, or the person who's not mentioned, is actually the most important person in that moment, or the person the author's trying to call attention to. So for all these reasons, I think it is a good time for this book, and it's a good book. Let me just say a word, maybe less about foreign policy, since we can talk about that, and everyone knows about that at this point, I think, and about the origins of neoconservatism. I was reading some of the articles in this book. I was reading some of the articles in the collection of my father's, which was called, more formally, Neoconservatism, the autobiography of an idea, with a collection of his essays from, I think, 1949 to 1995. And I was struck by the following, my father's quip that a neoconservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality is always repeated, and is true, and is, I think, deeply true in some respect. It does distinguish neoconservatism from conservatism. If you think of Bill Buckley's famous line, I think this was in the first issue of National Review, that National Review intended to, stand or thwart history, yelling stop or shouting stop, which is an admirable thing, I think, and it is worth saying here that I don't think neoconservatism could have succeeded to the degree it did without having an already existing conservative movement to build on, to join with, to modify in certain respects. But the spirit of sort of Bill Buckley's conservatism really was self-consciously to stand against history, yelling stop. And Whittaker Chambers makes this very clear. He's proud to be called a reactionary, Chambers says, I think, in one of the letters to Buckley. The spirit of neoconservatism is more agnostic, I would say, about the direction of history, less designed to be and proud to be reactionary, maybe dubious ultimately of the success of really standing athwart history, yelling stop, but certainly open to reality, and in a way being mugged by reality is a sort of a different attitude towards life than standing against history. There's room for both, I think, but certainly the distinctive neocon contribution, I think, was being mugged by reality and being open to the lessons of that mugging, if you want to call it that. And that mugging, I suppose, above all, was the collapse of sort of old-fashioned Cold War, pro-American, pro-constitutional liberalism in the 60s into what liberalism became. Mike Scully, who was a good friend of my father's and of mine and of many people in this room, who died quite young, edited the magazine This World, once had a wonderful line. I think my father made this quip in the 70s, I suppose, or it was reported in the 70s about neoconservatism, a neocon being a liberal who's mugged by reality. And then in reaction to neoconservatism's success, something grew up in the, I guess, early mid-'80s, neoliberalism. And this was supposed to be a reinvigoration of liberalism, a questioning of old liberal platitudes that had been taken for granted. And Mike Scully, at a book review, as I recall, once said that the trouble with the neoliberals is that they, too, like the neoconservatives, had been mugged by reality. The difference was that the neoliberals refused to press charges, which is really a deep, sort of a deep point. And I do think the essence of neoconservatism was not merely looking at what had happened and saying, ooh, something went wrong, and not merely saying, gee, it would be nice if we could go back to the way it was when things were healthier and when Hubert Humphrey and Scoop Jackson and other sort of admirable people were leading liberals. But it did lead, on the part of many people, certainly on the part of my father, but many people and many younger people, to a rethinking of liberalism. And ultimately, neoconservatism, I think, is friendly, of course, to American liberalism. In this respect, perhaps a little different from the National Review, sort of trying to reverse history or yelling stop, but a friendly critic or critical friend of American constitutional liberalism. In one essay my father wrote in 1993, which actually isn't in this book, and I'll just quote it for a sentence as a way of plugging his book, which I think is also in print, the book Neoconservatism, Selected Essays. In an essay called My Cold War, my father was explaining that he, of course, had been a staunch anti-communist. He had found at some point anti-communism to not be intellectually terribly interesting. The case has been made and remade and remade, and made by very great men and women from the 30s or before, I guess, even on through The God That Failed, and then through Solzhenitsyn. And it was a practical task to defeat communism, a major, important one, but not intellectually interesting. And he says that he himself got more interested in the weaknesses of liberalism than in simply fighting communism, important as that was. And he writes that what began to concern me more and more were the clear signs of rot and decadence germinating within American society, a rotten decadence that was no longer the consequence of liberalism, but was the actual agenda of contemporary liberalism. My father is always so mild-mannered in his writing and pulls his punches. And then he says, and therefore liberalism became the question. For me, then, neoconservatism was an experience of moral, intellectual, and spiritual liberation. And I do think, and this is, I think, comes clear from the essays in Irwin's book, that at its best, neoconservatism really isn't a doctrine, and neoconservatives aren't really a movement, but neoconservatism is a way of liberating oneself from the doctrines and cliches and assumptions of the age, both conservative, I would say, incidentally, as well as liberals. And so many of the conservative assumptions are sort of developed in reaction to liberal assumptions, but they're still only assumptions. And neoconservatism really became a way to think through the current moment and its challenges, and to think about alternate paths for the future. And I do think that Irwin's book, I hope Irwin's book, and think Irwin's book, helps us do that.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our three panelists for their characteristically insightful presentation. Now we turn it to the audience for your questions. Please keep your questions brief. Identify yourself, your institutional affiliation, if you have one, and wait for the boom microphone from Book TV before posing your question. Mm-hmm. Oh, there's no micro. Okay, then just raise your hand and identify. And any questions? Great.
My name is Diana Scott-Rath, and I'm with the Department of Labor. I'd like to ask the panelists one question. President Bush is about to be inaugurated in a couple of days. If you could all tell him one thing, give him one piece of advice, as a neoconservative, what would you do? What would that be?
Good, Bill, you're doing that every week, so.
Win the war in Iraq.
I think that's right. I mean, if you just think about what happens if they lose the war in Iraq, I mean, that would be the end of the presidency. I think everything is on the line at the end of the month and thereafter. That's why I was very brief talking about domestic policy. I mean, there's a lot of things people are interested in, tax cuts, Social Security, and so on. They're all trivial compared to whether he's got it right in Iraq and in the Middle East.
I agree. Sure. Okay, great. Other questions? Great. Yeah, John.
Press service. I wanted to take off on Mr. Weinstein's initial suggestion about questions regarding the importance of Israel and the relationship between the United States and Israel in neoconservative thought. Is it another thing that, in a sense, distinguishes it from traditional conservatism? And in light of Sharon's evident desire to withdraw, to disengage from Gaza and part of the West Bank, there seems to be something of a split within the persuasion about whether this should be supported or not supported. And I wondered if you could comment on that. I guess to Mr. Crystal, since he's the foreign policy person on the panel.
Well, I mean, plenty of non-neoconservatives have been generally pro-Israel, obviously. Well, you want to repeat the question first, Ken?
Sure. It's the questioner was Jim Loeb of the Interpress Service, someone who's obviously known around here. I had a question about the role of U.S.-Israel relations, how to distinguish conservatives from traditional conservatives on this matter, and also disputes in the persuasion, as he put it, over Prime Minister Sharon's plan to disengage from Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, I think most neoconservatives, but also certainly since Reagan and maybe before, since Nixon, I suppose, most conservatives, most Republicans have been pro-Israel, I mean, pro the U.S.-Israeli, for strengthening that relationship, sympathetic to Israel, fighting states and movements that deny its very right to existence. I think there's a diversity of views among neoconservatives about details of Israeli government policy, and frankly, most of us don't know that much about it since it's the internal decisions of another government, and most of us are probably uncertain, since I certainly am, since I don't know enough to have a sensible judgment about whether Sharon is exactly on the right track or not. I'm sympathetic to what he's doing personally, but I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on it any more than I am the other decisions of other friendly governments. One usually gives friendly governments the benefit of the doubt. So I don't think, I mean, I would just say this, at the Project for the New American Century, for example, we spent, and at the Weekly Standard for that matter, from 95 on, in the case of the Standard, from 97 on, in the case of PNAC, we spent, I'm sure we published more articles and put out more memoranda and letters on China, on NATO enlargement, actually, and certainly on Bosnia and Kosovo, and on Iraq, which I don't regard as particularly Israel-centric or particularly something that Israel was actually that interested in, to the best of my knowledge. It was our problem with Saddam, not Israel's. Israel had greater concerns with other countries in the region. So I think the notion that we're somehow Israel, at least in my case, in the case of many neoconservatives I know, that the whole policy is driven by a concern with Israel and with Israel's interests, I think that really is just false.
I think there's a dangerous, certainly in Europe, it's a very dangerous thing. If you look in the book, there are some sort of writers for mainstream newspapers who argue that the whole Iraq adventure was simply invented by Jewish Zionists in the Defense Department to further Israel's interests and have nothing to do with American interests. So that whole line of thought, and in fact, if you look at the European press, the Europeans are saying that, well, when Bush comes over, it's all well and good if he visits, but the real touchstone is going to be whether he's willing to force Sharon to a settlement with the Palestinians. So this, and since I think that highly unlikely, I therefore looking forward confidently to our continued rupture with the Europeans. But it's dangerous stuff in Europe, this point of view.
May I just add something?
Sure.
Yes. I entirely agree with the previous speakers. I'd like to add that I think actually supporting Israel, which is the only democracy in the Middle East, is actually very important, not only for America, but for the West, and so for Europe as well. And I have no problem whatsoever in stating that very clearly here. I also would like to say that I think most of European commentators and newspapers and some politicians are entirely wrong about this question. Of course, I am entirely in favor of the idea that it is very important to solve the Palestinian problem and create probably a Palestine state, but this cannot be done against Israeli democracy and should not be envisaged against Israeli democracy. So again, I think stating the support for democracy in Israel is absolutely crucial, not only for the United States, but also for Europe and the West.
Adrian Wooldridge.
Adrian Wooldridge, the Economist. I just wanted to ask Mr. Espada about a particularly brutal mugging by reality in the form of the slaughter of Theo van Gogh, and what the possible implications of that are for the spread of neoconservatism in Europe, and particularly for a rethinking of some of the more